Welcome to the SparkCom podcast, where we talk about trends, innovation, and what's coming next. My name is Manny Turan.
And I'm Adam Hartung.
And we are Spark Partners. You can go to our website, sparkpartners.com, to learn about what we offer to our clients. And Adam, how are things with you today?
They're good. They're good. And enjoying this nice winter day. Living in one of the advantages of living in the desert.
Indeed. So I am a hardcore sales guy. I've been in sales my whole professional career, except for 1 year where I was an official engineer. But beyond that, I've been a sales guy. And one of the things that was talked about in sales guy lore was the idea of nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. Have you heard of that before?
Absolutely. That was back in the day when the computer industry was first coming along, and we're buying mainframe computers, typewriters, a lot of automation, a lot of digitization was happening to business, and just IBM was the king of the kings.
Yeah, Big Blue was around for a long time and is still around, but we've got some interesting news to share today regarding really kind of where they've been the past 20 years. And in light of all of the momentum they've had with cloud computing and artificial intelligence, and I mean, they're a virtual laundry list of some giant trends that we're in now. So what's the story? Why aren't they coming out on top?
Well, I'm sure that we have two different groups of listeners to this podcast. We have people that are over 40 years old who will remember IBM and remember some of these stories that we've talked about here, like you just mentioned. And then there's going to be younger viewers and younger listeners, and they're going to say, what? IBM? Like, what's IBM? And they're going to wonder about why we're even having this discussion, because to them, IBM isn't even relevant. And that's what I think is really important story for us here. The interesting thing to me is if you took a look at IBM's stock performance, and you go back to the year 2000, January 2000, bring it up to today, that's 21 years. If you'd have bought the stock in January 2000, today you would be ahead 5.67%. That's not 5% per year. That's just under 6% altogether. At the same time, if you'd have bought a share of Apple, you'd be up 14,900%. So one's clearly performed substantially better than the other one, right? And that's just gets to the relevancy of the two companies. Last Friday, IBM announced earnings again, and the stock dropped 7.7%, and it did so badly that on a day when the Nasdaq was up, all the tech companies were up. Pretty much the market was up. The Dow was down because IBM did so badly. It just really performed poorly. But of the last 34 quarters, think about that. We're talking about 8.5 years. IBM's revenue declined in 30 of those quarters. So year over year, their revenue was down in 30 out of 34 quarters across 8 years. Starting in 2014, go back in that era, they had 20 consecutive quarters of revenue decline. 20 consecutive quarters of revenues went down. What do you suppose they were focused on, Manny?
They were focused likely on their value delivery.
Yeah. And they were talking about what? The earnings, right? They said, earnings, we managed earnings. And I just want to bring this back to the number one story that we always want to talk to people about. You need to measure your revenues. Okay, so revenues are the number one thing that we have to manage. If our revenues aren't going up, then they're going to somebody else. And we start talking about, if you talk about managing earnings, and I want to be clear, if people are investors out there and you start hearing the leadership talk about, don't worry about revenues, we're managing earnings, that means they're fiddling with it because they're fiddling with the accounting. Because there's so many different ways you can account for things. There's nothing wrong with that. It makes sense. Different businesses manage themselves differently. But we have to remember, you can change these things. You can engineer your earnings, right? And that's what IBM was doing, was they were engineering earnings instead of thinking about where they're growing their business. And they were putting their money in the wrong spots. In first quarter of 2014, IBM spent $8 billion buying its stock back. To what what good does that do? Does that raise revenues? Of course it doesn't raise revenues. In fact, to get the money to buy the stock back, which they continued to do all the way up through 2020, they were actually not doing product development. They were shutting down R&D. If you went back 30 years ago, IBM was always the number one company in terms of patent applications and patents issued. Well, they've certainly fallen off that perch, right?
Well, how is that possible? I mean, how do they even, what is their leadership thinking by basically killing their cash generating,
Business,
value
right?
creation cow, right? Their R&D. That's like the foundation of at least my generation knows of IBM as being basically a think tank, having developed the personal computer as we know it now, right? They were first, and then of course Apple came right after, and then they walked away from that business. They developed the hard drive, the magnetic tape. Every time we walk into a hotel room and we swipe that thing or we use a credit card, that was IBM, right? They did Watson, they did all this AI stuff, and of course, why would they do that?
Well, I think it gets into that question that we've talked about so many times. That we always tell people the thing they need to focus on in their business is their, go ahead, Manny.
Customers.
Right. And when you're serving your customers, you know what your value proposition is, right?
Yeah, of course.
How am I making things happen with them? What we start seeing here is people moving away from saying, I developed those great technologies to help people do their business better, right? I invent these technologies because it's good. The hotel likes the product that you described, the customer likes the product you described. These are innovations that are making people's lives better. It's something that's happening in the world that's good. But companies can drift away from that, and they start focusing on what you said earlier, their value delivery system. Well, we've got this division, it makes these products, and we're busy inventing for making products. It goes back to our interview last week with Doug, they're in Arizona at the University of Arizona, where he's working with inventions and he's just trying to figure out how to license them. But he's not saying, well, what's the market value of it?
Right.
He's saying, I got a university, we invent things, let's get them ready for licensing. In business, we don't have that luxury. We can't sit around and say, well, we're just inventing things for the fun of inventing things. We need to invent things that the market wants. Yeah. But you get trapped in that value delivery system, inventing or innovating around how I'm going to deliver what I've always done, rather than thinking about what does the market actually need. And so if you ask yourself today, what's the value proposition of IBM? I would have no idea how to answer that question.
Yeah, I have no idea either. And they also have a significant branding problem. For being a company that large and being in so many places, most average 32-year-olds don't know who they are.
Right.
Let alone a 25-year-old that's, just getting their career started.
So you go back to when they were, largely a hardware company, and they made hardware. They were really successful with the mainframe. They were really successful with the mini computer. They invented the PC, but they let that business get away from them by outsourcing the operating system. And Microsoft got more money out of that than IBM ever did. And they were really in trouble as a hardware company. And then along came this guy, Lou Gerstner, who'd actually been at Procter & Gamble. He wasn't even a computer guy at all. And he recognized the problem. He said, well, what's your value to customers? What do customers really need? And the people at IBM were, didn't really know how to answer that question. So he undertook some studies at the senior level, came back and he said, you know what, we've sold a lot of hardware, but people don't manage it very well. They don't use it very well. And so what they really need is they need some consulting, and they need some help around software and software implementations and how to get everybody using this technology much better. And of course, that's what we now call services or software services. And he took IBM and he said, we're going to become the world's biggest helper in terms of helping customers use their technology. And that saved him. I mean, Lou Gerstner got incredibly famous for having turned IBM around. And what did he do? Well, he said, you had a value proposition, which was digitizing the world through this hardware. And then you kind of got focused on just making computers, and you forgot, to think about what customers need, which is services. And so then he refocused them on a new value proposition, the services, and IBM came back strong in the 80s and 90s. Then what we see again, by the time you get to the year 2000, now he's gone, new leadership, and the leadership's again saying, well, okay, how do we work quarter to quarter, sell more what we've always sold? And they stopped paying attention to customers. They stopped going out there saying, what's the big trend? What do people need? So they missed the trend of mobile. They missed the trend of networking. They missed, all these computer trends that came along. And then they also missed the software trends that came along, software as a service, cloud computing. They weren't looking at any of that. They were busy managing earnings, busy looking at their value delivery system. So it's the same problem that a small company has. It's just amplified and made so much bigger. But the way that we could see this happening, and the reason we could be critical of this, was that it was demonstrated by declining revenues. And that's the big thing that I want to make sure that all of our listeners are always paying attention to. It doesn't really matter what your earnings are if your revenues aren't growing, right? Because you can manipulate it. I remember I went into a small company one day and they said, well, we're very, very worried about how much money we make. And, it's not been doing well for us for the last couple of years. And Grandpa founded the business and Dad seemed to run it well. And we're struggling right now. Then they said, we just need to, we need to generate more cash. We need to make more money. And I said, well, what are you going to do long term? And they had not even thought about this. Well, this is the business we're in, right? We do this. This is what we do. And they weren't thinking about their customers at all. I said, well, if you want short-term money, I said, just go lay everybody off and sell all the desks because that'll generate real quick money, right?
Yeah.
You'll be out of business in a year. But the question is, if you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to be out of business in 3, 4, 5 years anyway. So why not just do it fast and pocket all the money you possibly can? Oh, they got so angry with me. They were so angry with me for saying that. But, the issue was they were sitting there saying, I want to focus on the returns rather than focusing on my customer value. And that's always measured in terms of revenue.
It's something that I've seen quite a bit as well with a lot of small businesses out there. They're always trying to focus in on cutting costs, making their value delivery more efficient. And, most of the conversation is about how they're going to make their current business internally better with very little focus on what the most important thing is getting sales through the door. Sales is the lifeblood of an organization.
Absolutely.
They always give it a level of mystique of all those sales guys and this, that, when they really should be turning the whole company around and looking at how can they increase their sales by empowering their sales staff, by increasing their marketing budget and making the marketing razor sharp. And they oftentimes look inward. And
the second thing is a lot of people, when they think about their customers, they think, I can go ask the customer what he or she wants, and they'll tell me and I'll make that for them. And that's actually not a very good approach. This sort of ask the customer, bring in our biggest customers and do one of these workshops, or even doing it by Zoom, right? Why? Well, because customers are only thinking of you in terms of what can you do for me now? So they got a way of doing business. They're buying your product. And so they basically want it more, better, faster, cheaper, provide more value. That's not what they're there. They want you to do things better, faster, cheaper so they can make more money. And so IBM got into that trap in a really big way. We saw about 5, 6 years ago, what was actually happening, the big game that was happening was the developer wars. Could Apple continue to get developers in mass writing for iOS? Got to keep that ball rolling forward, getting more and more apps in iOS. Well, Google was trying to do the same thing, getting more and more people to write apps that were going to go on to Android. And Microsoft is now falling out of the game completely. This is at the end of the Ballmer era, right? And so the big fight's happening around, can we get these developers? And what does IBM do? They go out and they do a survey of their customers. They find out that most of their customers like using iOS. They have a lot of iOS devices in their organizations. And so they said, well, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do enterprise applications in iOS. Now, the problem with that is it's not really a value proposition. It's trying to say, okay, we're going to try to go out, and because we have connections in big companies, we're going to figure out some way that we're going to use somebody else's technology that somebody else developed and try to just help it perform a little bit better. Well, that's destined to not offer much value, right? It's just you're delivering. You're literally doing nothing but delivering Apple's value. Apple's got the iOS, Apple's got the devices, Apple's got the apps, and you're saying, well, what we're going to do is we're going to enterprise that. And so you're saying, I have a value delivery system. It was guaranteed not to do well, and of course it didn't, right? They didn't figure out what's coming next and say, oh, what's going to happen with this is down the road is going to be cloud. And what we need to do is get out there and come up with cloud services, because that's where, of course, Amazon was doing
right.
well.
I mean, they try to go in that direction, but I guess one of the lessons that we like to talk about here is, when you're going to innovate, when you're going to go out in the direction of where customers are, you've got to be smart enough to be able to cut bait on everything else. And they're so big, and I mean, that machine is such an unwieldy beast that I don't even know how they would even do that. How can they really put all their muscle behind one giant innovation if they've got about 20 different, sharks on the line.
Right. I mean, they had, I think, 10 divisions at that point, and they're looking at all 10 divisions, almost like, somebody playing 10 hands of cards at the tables in Vegas, right? And trying to say, well, which one of these hands do I think is going to be the one that's going to come up, with the big win, or 10.
Which is, I think, very different than how the Virgin Group has done it. Maybe that'd be a good comparison to discuss, because the Virgin Group's got, 45, 50 different companies in parallel, but they're all distinct and they're all clean. Whereas IBM, it's not so clean.
Well, yes. And a big thing there is that at Virgin, what we see is every business that they launch is focused on a trend in a marketplace. So they'll say, what's happening in mobile, what's happening in the way people are connecting. And they're looking at the business saying, what's happening in the world, and how do I make that, how do I build on what's happening in the world? How do I build on that trend? Whereas in IBM, what we see is people saying, what's our capability? And then how do I try to deliver that capability to the customer? So they're doing it from the inside out rather than the outside in. So, like, for example, let's take artificial intelligence. It's one of the 4 big trends that we talk about in the ebook. It's definitely one of the biggest things that's going to happen over the next 10 years. IBM has an artificial intelligence division. They've had one for over 10 years. Unfortunately, its revenues aren't going anywhere. In the last quarter, revenues declined 4.5% in the AI division. So what do you have to say to yourself? We're not doing it right. It's one thing to say I'm in AI. It's one thing to say it's a big trend. But if you're not growing your revenues in that area, then you're not obviously providing the value. You're busy trying to say, well, I've got tools, I've got capabilities. Let me slam those tools and capabilities in the market. But if people aren't buying them, what they're telling you is that, hey, look, you might think you know about artificial intelligence, but you don't know how to apply it in a way that I can use it to make more money. So therefore, your revenues aren't going up. So once again, we're back to the whole problem of, are you looking at the right thing? Are you looking at revenue growth? Just saying you've got artificial intelligence capability, even having it isn't enough. I mean, if you want to be in Doug's world in universities, that's one thing. But if you're in the marketplace, having the technology, having the capability is insufficient. It's got to be taken to the point of saying, I'm generating revenues with it. And then you're in the right spot.
I mean, are they doomed? Are they basically on their way out? Or is there some way they can resurrect their position on the hill?
Well, they've got to start to take much more of an external viewpoint. There's just no doubt about that. So the CEO that failed them horribly was a person named Virginia Romney. She went by Jenny Romney, was the CEO for 8 years, from 2012 to 2020, averaged $30 million compensation a year through this debacle. So what we see is horribly, they took this person who graduated in 1981. I think she graduated in 79, and it's 1981. She comes to work for IBM. She's just an internal person, works her way up through the bureaucracy, fights all these internal wars and gets to the top. But that's not how we need to pick a CEO. And unfortunately, when she left in December, they took another insider and put that insider in the role as well. The first thing that they have to do is the board of directors absolutely has to get an outsider in as the CEO, someone who can be market focused, not internally focused. Like what happened back when Gerstner came in from Procter & Gamble and changed the organization. Somebody can really look outside in the world and say, hey, what's happening out there, and how can we add value, and where do we add value? And then the second thing they need to do is go through a very serious restructuring of how they spend their resources. They're letting a bottom-up SAP type of a system drive their resource allocation, right? An ERP, I shouldn't have said SAP particularly, that's just a brand, but the ERP system is driving their resource allocation. Instead, they need to sit back and say, wait a minute, what are we investing in that's dead, that's old? We got to cut our costs, we got to cut what we spend in the stuff that's never going to grow. And then find the areas that they do see where there is future growth. Apple's sitting there looking at future growth. Google's got future growth. Facebook's got future growth. Amazon has future growth, right? So there's markets out there where you can grow. I don't want to pick the market in this podcast to say which market I think they ought to select, because there's actually a lot of them, and they have a lot of resources. They've certainly let go of a lot of resources, thrown them away, spent them on stock buybacks and bad uses of capital. But they still have a lot, and they could still get back in the game, because look at what happened to Microsoft. They changed the CEO. Ballmer went out, Nardella
Right.
came in. He said, we're going to cut dramatically the spending that we have on the app, on the PC, Windows and Office, we're just overspending there dramatically. And he shoved the resources over to the cloud, right? And so now Microsoft's number 2 in cloud. They're behind AWS, and they're very, very competitive in that marketplace. They've won a lot of contracts. They are a very, very strong number 2, and it's brought Microsoft back in a big way. And then they changed their funding in gaming also, which has gone very badly for 15 years. And they've reorganized that now to where they're much more successful in the gaming marketplace. So where Microsoft looked like we would write them off 5 years ago, 6 years ago, it's easy to say now you could write off IBM. And that's what will happen. I mean, they'll go the way of DEC, Digital Equipment, and Wang, and these names that the young people have never heard of. They're going to go, or Sun Microsystems, which is a newer one. That's the way they're headed right now, unless they get a new CEO. And I think to get a new CEO, they need a new board of directors. And they should come in and say, look, we've got to rethink this company. We've got to rethink his future before it's too late.
What's remarkable about what we're talking about here, Adam, is the effect of leadership. Leadership is the foundational driver of the organization to align or not align with trends, focus or not focus on their value. And you hit the nail on the head. We've had a couple of big turnarounds in the past 5-10 years, Microsoft being one of those, because leadership came in and made some very, I would say weighty decisions, but would in the end give them a longer life. We had a podcast, maybe was it 9 months ago or 8 months ago, that were about Disney, and they were going down a really dark path. They brought in a CEO, actually an internal guy, that you and I thought was maybe not the right choice.
Correct.
But then he made some decisions that were sort of eye-opening and caused them to at least stabilize, and now are setting their sights on a higher growth trajectory.
Yes. I think what we see, like Disney's a great example, because we look at people that are internal and we tend to think they're going to keep the ship going the direction that it was going. And what that CEO did was he said, the world has changed and I'm going to change my resource allocation to meet what's happening in the world in terms of entertainment, the movies, the theme parks, et cetera. And he changed his resource allocation. And that's what we're looking at here is we need somebody that stops looking internally at how to manage internal and look externally in terms of how to meet needs. How do I go from I can really run a good value delivery system to I can identify a really powerful value proposition, such as what Gerstner had done and what Nardella has done at Microsoft. So leaders really do matter. But the good leaders, we get this confused because a lot of people seem to think good leaders are ones that know how to really manage an organization, crack the whip, know the numbers, all these kinds of things. But what we've learned is that the really good leaders, they understand metrics, but they really have their minds and their eyes on the external world. They're spending a lot of time looking out in the world. What's happening in the world? What do I have to do to meet the customer needs? How do I build on the trend? How do I become the leader in an area where I'm the thought leader and I'm taking where the customer wants to go and I'm getting them right? And
what's remarkable? What's remarkable is that the things that these leaders are doing can be learned. Can be taught and it can be learned. It's not some magic power that appears out of nowhere. And that's what we spent all this time on developing our course called Think Innovation, which really arms the small, medium, large business owner with the right tools to think like an innovator, to start looking outward versus inward, and to start aligning their business towards where the market is going, not where it is today, where it was in the history of the company. So,
I mean, historical resource allocation systems, they just project the past. So you see this trend line, and we spent some money there. We spent 3, 5, 10% a year. Let's keep doing that. Okay. And that's the way, because they're built on accounting systems. And so they're built to drive the resources down the road that it's been. They're not built to create something new. I never forget when I was with PepsiCo and we were launching Pizza Hut home delivery. And I went in and I said, okay, we've got these guys who are driving the cars, they're delivering the pizzas. And I need a category for that, a payroll category for that, because they're not really a server. We don't compensate them like a server. We compensate them specifically to this job of being a driver, which included some money for miles and things like that. And I'll never forget, the CIO pulls me aside and says, no, we're not going to do that. And I said, what? And he goes, well, we only have 9 fields available for a type of worker, and we've used all 9. So since we only have 9, you're not allowed to have a category, an occupation called driver. Now, talk about inside out. We're saying we can't, here's a business with a job, and we can't even put it in the payroll system because you can't handle it. I said, well, okay, fine. Let me just go let ADP do the payroll for my little startup business over here doing home delivery. We'll start off with ADP, and they can handle on the outside. And the guy wanted to kill me. He literally wanted to kill me.
It's remarkable. Yeah, absolutely.
We're not going to take that outside. So, leaders just have to be much more open to this, using external resources, looking at external markets, figuring out where things are going, and then letting us get there, right? Letting us get to that external point of view, rather than saying, well, I manage this and I have control of this and I want to keep control of this and I want to continue to manage this and I want to show my ability to manage those resources in this existing world, and to be saying, how do I get outside of that? How do I get to those bigger, better growth opportunities?
Yes, absolutely. Well, with that, we've run out of time for today, Adam, and certainly a great conversation. And invite all of our listeners and viewers to go to our website of sparkpartners.com. And our course is set to release later this week, so we're pretty excited about that. And with that, Adam, have a wonderful week, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you very much, Manny. You too.
Take care.